So if you're a living organism, you need things to survive because a living organism feasts and sucks energy from its environment in one way or another. So you always have a list of things you need for survival. Every organism does. So you might need X to survive, but the problem is there's some other organism within reality. Because see, by definition, an organism is not the totality of reality. An organism is a subpart of reality. Every organism is only a part of the whole. So by definition, if you have one organism, you're going to have multiple organisms. And these organisms, by virtue of the fact that they're different from each other, they're not all the same organism, they're going to have different survival requirements because every form has a different need to maintain its different shape, you see? And so if I need X to survive, you might need the opposite of X to survive, you see? And therein lies the fundamental incompatibility and conflict. So there are zero-sum dynamics baked into finite things, all finite things. All forms exist as trade-offs with other forms. If you want to think of it very abstractly, you can think of it as like concave versus convex. If you take an object, like a rectangular object, and you want to cut it into two, you can either cut it straight down the middle, then you'll have two equal parts, or you can do sort of a circular section, cut, then you're going to have one that's concave and one that's convex. But when you're making that circular cut through this rectangular single solid object, you're going to cut it into two parts, two subparts. But you see how the concave and the convex are they're interdefined. You can't really have one without the other. So this is the nature of how consciousness works in these dualities. This is just the existential nature of form. So then what happens is that you draw these boundaries and you have these forms, and then they enter into a competition with each other. And in a sense, what's happening is that God is playing a tug of war with itself, because God is the entire thing. It's all the subparts. But then the question arises, which subpart is stronger than the other? Because they're not all equally strong. Each form has its own pros and cons as to what it's able to do. For example, the form of a screwdriver is different from the form of a hammer, is different from the form of a knife, and they all do different things and they can excel at different things, but they also have their own weaknesses. There's things that a knife is weak at that a hammer is strong at, and vice versa. And same, of course, for all living organisms. And you see, so the problem for God then is you have all these parts, and all of these parts are not infinitely powerful. They all have weaknesses. There's always a trade-off. And so because of this, no one part is able to monopolize and gain a stranglehold over all the other parts. You can't have one part of God rule over all of God. This is the interesting aspect of God's design. Every part must have a weakness, because God itself, the totality, is the highest power. You see, the highest power in the universe is not to be a finite thing, it's to be infinite, and by being infinite, you include all the finite subcomponents within yourself, right? So wholeness, we've talked about this in my episodes about wholeness and holism, it is the highest power. Oneness is the highest power. And so then that leaves God observing its finite subparts wrestling with themselves, you see? And then because God is indiscriminate and a lack of bias and infinite love, it can't choose favorites. It can't love one part more than another part, you see? It's only the parts that have biases and that prefer one part over some other part. So you might think that, like, well, Leo, surely God loves the defending side in a war more than God loves the attacking side of the war. Like the invading army, like surely God loved the Polish people more than he loved the German people in World War II, more than he loved Hitler who attacked and invaded Poland. Surely, right? No. That's your bias. Because you're a human and you have a certain allegiance, an agenda, maybe an anti-German agenda or a pro-Polish agenda or whatever, or maybe your agenda is that you want world peace. That's still your agenda. See, God can't have such a bias and such an agenda. So for God, it just observes and loves all of it equally. That it has to, because that's what God is. It's oneness, it's love. Oneness means it incorporates everything. That means it has to love Hitler. It has to love the invader as much as the defender. And so God can't choose sides. It has to remain totally neutral. Now, for a very selfish and biased organism, this seems like there's something wrong with God. It's like, Leo, this is very wrong. God can't just be neutral about Hitler. God has to hate Hitler and punish Hitler the way that I want, the way my ego wants, the way my survival demands. But that's precisely what God cannot do, you see, because you're selfish and God is selfless. And your selfishness is preventing you from realizing the power of God's infinite selflessness and infinite love. And so when you are asking God to hate on your behalf, you're actually infecting and corrupting God with your own ego. So the dilemma for God is, how does God divide up its power? Well, it's not really a dilemma for God because God doesn't really care. But if you're identified as some subpart of God, then you really care. See, you're attached to having power given to you by God. You want as much power given to you by the universe. See, you want the strongest army. You want the strongest country. You want the strongest family. You want the biggest bank account. You want the most sex. You want all the most favorable conditions for your survival. That's your selfishness talking. But you see, the problem is that you're not the only one. You're not the only subpart of God. There's an infinite number of subparts of God. So why would God give you more of that power than it would give to others? See, you want all of these goodies, but so does Hitler. So do your enemies. See, and you feel that you deserve it more than Hitler and your enemies, but God doesn't see it that way. Reality doesn't see it that way because it's truly unbiased.